Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. In this time between Series 1 and Series 2, we're exploring themes in the works of the early Fathers and trends in their times. This week we'll consider pseudo-scriptural literature, the non-canonical Gospels, epistles, and apocalypses that appeared in antiquity and continue to appear in our news feed today. About a quarter century ago, when I was working in the newspaper business, I wrote a story with the simple title, Apocrypha Now. I was, of course, very cleverly evoking the movie Apocalypse Now with Martin Sheen and Marlon Brando. But I got the assignment and I chose the title because in the early 1990s, the apocryphal Gospels were not simply a thing of the past. They were news. They were now. They were current events. And since the early 1990s, they've only become bigger news. More recent discoveries in the last 20 years have commanded the attention of all the major media outlets. They've been the subject of feature-length documentaries. They've pitted National Geographic magazine against Smithsonian magazine in fierce competition. Why? Because these are prime opportunities to corner the nerd market. But they're also perceived as important moments in a culture war, a time when news writers and publishers can upend the Christian view of the past and force us to rethink our present and future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should begin by defining some terms. First, what are the Apocrypha? What does the word Apocrypha mean? In Greek it means hidden away. That's all. Nothing more. We use it to refer to early Christian books that are not part of our scriptures. They don't appear in our Bibles. Though many of them bear the names of biblical figures like James and John and Peter and Mary, they were at some point judged to be inauthentic. In fact, most of them were produced a century or two, or even 3 centuries after the books of the canonical New Testament. Some of the Apocrypha were probably written as imaginative entertainments. They were like the novels that people today write about Pontius Pilate or Herod or Mary Magdalene. The author hoped to inspire and edify his readers, so he responded to their real curiosity about the gaps in the gospel story. He told the story of Jesus' childhood, or what went on behind the scenes at Jesus' trial. Some of these writings were enormously popular, as early as the first half of the 2nd century. The Church did nothing to oppose these books, but never treated them like scripture. They were widely read, but they were not read in the liturgy. They were not cited as authoritative. But there were other books whose authors were not so benign in their intentions. These Apocrypha also bore the names of New Testament celebrities, but they did so for the express purpose of hijacking ancient authority. Hijacking it and placing it at the service of a counter-gospel. They offered a teaching that differed in important respects from Orthodox Christianity. Gnostic heretics, for example, placed no value on the physical body or the physical suffering of Jesus. They dismissed any notion of atonement as it was understood in the New Testament. So they composed books like the 3rd century Revelation of Peter that portrayed Jesus as escaping from his body and laughing above the cross. All that blood, it seems, and all that talk about blood, was just an elaborate joke. It was a diversion. In other Gnostic books, attributed to James, John, Mary, and others, we learn that Jesus brought salvation not for the world at large, not for the rabble, but only for an elite group of people in the know, which is the literal meaning of the word Gnostic. Now, these are the kinds of Apocrypha that caught the attention of the bishops and scholars of the early church. They were written expressly for the purpose of undermining the faith that was held by ordinary Christian congregations. They were written to contradict the traditional narrative. These were among the reasons why the church began very early to speak of a specified canon of sacred writings. In fact, one of the more industrious heretics, a man named Marcion, may have been the first to make a list of his own approved writings. He wanted nothing to do with the Old Testament, and he wanted to rid the New Testament of any and all traces of Jewish influence. In his canon, he accepted only the Gospel according to St. Luke and a few heavily edited portions of St. Paul's letters. Marcion was a shipbuilder, and he had a lot of money to propagate his crazy gospel. During his lifetime, he enjoyed the kind of success his money could buy. He published books. He gathered followers. He founded a school. So it was imperative that the church set the record straight. In the time of Marcion and immediately afterward, we find a growing number of church fathers, such as Justin and Tatian and Irenaeus, insisting on the fourfold gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nothing more and nothing less and nothing other. In the years immediately following, we see the appearance of an even fuller list. It's known today as the Moratorian canon, and it contains most of what we now call the New Testament. It's missing the letter to the Hebrews and one of the epistles of John, as well as the letters of Peter and James. The unknown compiler of that list acknowledges that forgers in his day are producing false texts and passing them off as apostolic. He makes the list in order to provide a ruler, a yardstick, a measuring stick, and the Greek word for such a tool is canon. The compiler's contemporary, St. Irenaeus of Lyon, was similarly concerned with sorting the good books from the bad. Irenaeus was widely acknowledged as an authority in his day because he had received the faith from the elderly Polycarp, who had received it directly from the Apostle John. He was extremely close to the sources. In the chain that connected him to Jesus, there were just two links, and one of those links was Jesus' beloved disciple. Yet Irenaeus lived to see a day when heresies proliferated in the world, and many of them put forth false scriptures. Today he is best known for his massive catalog of false doctrines. His book Against the Heresies fills 3 sizable volumes in English. In that book, he preserved a rather helpful record of Apocrypha that were available in his time. From some of them he quotes extensively, and those quotations are valuable because they're all that's left of those particular books. They were the only record, for example, of the Gospel of Judas, which fell out of print in the 2nd century and was missing until just a few years ago. The idea of a canon was there throughout the 100s, and the greatest scripture scholar of the 200s, Origen of Alexandria, made a hard distinction between sacred scripture and apocryphal writings. And when he dismissed the Apocrypha, he named names. Early in the 4th century, we see the first listings that match up exactly with the table of contents in our New Testament today. That doesn't mean that there were raging disputes before then. There weren't. Some churches, it seems, did not recognize Hebrews. Some did not permit the book of Revelation to be read publicly. Some hesitated about the letters of Peter. But in the main, all the churches of the world agreed about which books had authority and which books could be read at Mass. There were in the ancient church the canonical books and the Apocrypha, and the Apocrypha ranged in quality from harmless entertainment to poisonous heresy. Now, that's a quick roundup, a summary of the facts about the early Christian texts that have been excluded from the canon. Those are the facts. But there is also a myth about those books. There is a grand narrative that's presumed by the popular media, and unfortunately by certain scholars as well, when they speak about the canon and the Apocrypha. The myth goes something like this. There was no single strain of early Christianity that could be identifiable as apostolic or orthodox. There was no Christianity in the singular, only Christianities in the plural. There were different congregations competing for the hearts and minds of the same believers and potential believers. To teach their doctrine, they all produced books. According to the myth, the books that eventually became the Christian canon were those books favored by the winners in that ancient, titanic, Darwinian struggle for dominance in the early church. According to the myth, the bishops of the Catholic Church, men like Polycarp and Irenaeus, ruthlessly suppressed all the books that didn't hew their particular line of Christian doctrine. Why? Because that's what Catholic bishops do, and we all know that. But there are problems with the myth. First of all, the Catholic bishops had no real power to suppress books. Remember, through the first 3 centuries after Jesus ascended to heaven, the practice of the faith was illegal. Christian books were banned, and it was a capital crime to own them. Bishops were, by virtue of their office, criminals. They held no power they could impose on anyone. All they possessed was the authority they had received from the apostles. They wielded that sometimes with full rhetorical force, but that hardly counts as brutal suppression. If the author and publisher of the Gospel of Judas wanted to take their books to the streets, there was nothing a man like Irenaeus could do to stop them. They were free to do so. They were free to risk their lives the way Irenaeus risked his. They were free also to die a martyr's death. The truth is that the Gospel of Judas, like all the Gnostic Gospels, and like most of the Apocrypha, was not worth dying for. In fact, most of it wasn't even worth the time anyone spent reading it. Most of the Apocrypha lacks the sobriety of the Gospel accounts. Almost every page has about it the stench of credulity. Some of the Apocrypha are thick with miracle stories whose only purpose seems to be to amaze. In the infancy Gospel of Thomas, for example, the toddler Jesus breathes life into clay birds. He stretches beams in his father's carpentry shop, and he strikes dead a teacher who dared to punish him. In the Arabic infancy Gospel, young Jesus turns his cruel playmates into goats. According to infancy Thomas, the boy's neighbors lived in constant fear, moving St. Joseph to cry out, "Don't let Jesus go outside the door because anyone who angers him dies." The miracles in these Gospels are spectacles, special effects to distract the readers from the lack of a plot that's believably human or believably divine. Their Jesus is a thin character and sometimes obnoxious. In the Gospel of Judas, he's contemptuous of his apostles, who are manifestly stupid. Several times he laughs at them and openly mocks them. There's a qualitative difference between these interactions and similar moments in the Gospels of the New Testament. In the canonical Gospels, the apostles weary Jesus, and he says so. But the implication is that he expects so much more from them. The implication is that he loves them. Not so in the Gospel of Judas. There Jesus appears, in the words of Adam Gopnik of the New Yorker, as, quote, "one more know-it-all with a nimbus," unquote. Adam Gopnik is an atheist with a Jewish background who confesses a mild interest in Buddhist meditation techniques. Yet without the benefit of faith, he judged the apocryphal Gospel of Judas and found it sorely wanting. The truth about the Apocrypha is not what the myth suggests. It's not that these books were suppressed, brutally or otherwise. The truth is that they went quietly out of print, like most books that are published, like many of my books, unfortunately. And they went out of print because they weren't worth keeping in print. People didn't recommend them breathlessly to their friends. People didn't wear out their copies from reading and rereading. Certainly, people weren't willing to die for possession of the apocryphal books. We have no evidence that the Roman authorities ever prosecuted a single case of possession of the Gospel of Judas. but we have plenty of accounts of successful convictions of those who were caught with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The media and their academic enablers invent drama to explain the disappearance of long-ago texts, but the real story is more plodding and prosaic. A lot like the actual texts of so much of the Gnostic Apocrypha. It's worth our time, however, to ask where the myth comes from. And that's what I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about. Throughout the modern era, there's been an awareness of the apocryphal Gospels and intermittent interest in them. Mark Twain found them fascinating and took from them the inspiration of some of his later stories and at least one novel. He liked them because he had little use for mainstream Christianity or its God. He preferred the Gnostic Gospels because they explicitly opposed the God who created this world and considered him to be an evil murderer. But Twain's warmed-over Gnostic stories were hardly his best work and were quickly forgotten. 19th century scholars like Ernest Renan engaged the apocryphal literature and used it to challenge the orthodox narrative of history. But the problem, in the end, is that so much of it is just not very interesting. At the middle of the 20th century, however, something big happened, and I believe this event provided the perfect conditions for the flourishing of the myth of the lost Gospels. That event took place almost immediately after the end of the Second World War. I'm talking about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Almost 1,000 manuscripts were discovered in the years 1946 to 1956 at Khirbet Qumran. They trickled onto the market slowly, gradually generating excitement. They were all religious texts produced in the last 3 centuries BC and the 1st century AD. Some of them were biblical texts, some were biblical commentaries, some presented fevered apocalyptic speculation. This was clearly an unprecedented find, a sudden dump of hundreds of previously unknown Jewish texts. Here was a window thrown open with the breathtaking view of Judaism in the time of Jesus. The newspapers reported the discovery with great excitement. The story had the air of a treasure hunt, with hints of Aladdin. A shepherd boy found the first batch of scrolls when he threw a stone into a cave and heard a jar shatter. One of the scrolls, in fact, purported to be an actual treasure map, with clues to the hiding place of the gold of the Jerusalem temple. The emergence of the scrolls coincided, more or less, with the founding of modern Israel as a Jewish state in 1948. This intensified the sense of drama, and the newborn state made the most of the publicity. The scholars who were granted access became international celebrities. As passages were published and leaked to the public, excitement grew. Some of the archaeologists and linguists who were assigned to study the scrolls were Roman Catholics, and most of them found their faith strengthened by their work. The scrolls confirmed what they already believed about the social, religious, and cultural context of Jesus' ministry. The scrolls just made everything more vivid. But the scholars worked slowly and secretively, and people throughout the world were curious about the message and the meaning of the scrolls. At the time, The New Yorker was arguably the most prestigious popular periodical in the United States, and the magazine made a decision to capitalize on that curiosity in a capital way. One of the New Yorker's most respected writers, Edmund Wilson, would undertake an in-depth study of the scrolls, and the magazine agreed to fund his travel to Israel for lengthy stays among the scholars and visits to Khirbet Qumran. With that kind of backing, the magazine would have the opportunity to establish the grand narrative about the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wilson, it seems, in retrospect, was an odd choice to write on the subject. He knew none of the relevant ancient languages. He had no expertise in or great familiarity with any of the appropriate academic disciplines. He was in his mid-50s and had won renown as a literary critic and essayist. Early in the century, he rode the cresting waves of interest in Karl Marx, and then Sigmund Freud. Those fads, however, were waning by mid-century, and Wilson was distancing himself from his earlier enthusiasms. But of all he learned from Marx and Freud, he held on most tenaciously to one thing: their bitter contempt for biblical religion. Wilson's masters had no use for Judaism or Christianity. Marx considered all religion to be an opiate for the masses. For Freud, it was merely an illusion with a future that was unpromising at best. Wilson's story was set from the get-go. The deepest meaning and message and significance of the scrolls would be to reveal Christianity as an utter fraud. Wilson's reports began appearing in the New Yorker and were later compiled in a book, The Scrolls from the Dead Sea, published in 1955. Later in life, he published a second book, this one with Oxford University Press, titled The Dead Sea Scrolls, 1947 to 1969. From the title onward, Wilson presents his own studies as definitive, even though he was rejecting many of the conclusions of the scholars who best knew the scrolls. When challenged, he explained that the religious commitments of the scholars had rendered them untrustworthy. They had an agenda. Wilson, on the other hand, in spite of his ignorance of the languages and history, had a view unimpeded by dogmatic commitments, or so he believed. His books, however, show him to be a man strangely obsessed. Obsessed, in fact, with Jesus. He sees Jesus everywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls present a teacher of righteousness, and Wilson identifies this figure as a model of the character of Jesus. The community that produced the scrolls initiated members through ritual washing. To Wilson, that is clearly the source of Jesus' practice of baptism. The scrolls also show the community sharing a ritual meal of bread and wine. So you begin to see where Jesus got all his best ideas. Even when the scrolls present a doctrine in flat contradiction of Christianity, Wilson still sees Jesus there with his sticky messianic fingers. For example, the scrolls instruct readers to hate their enemies and hate the sons of darkness. But Jesus urged his disciples to love their enemies and pray for their persecutors. Wilson is untroubled by this. He says it's explained entirely by the process of evolution. Christian doctrine merely adopted the doctrine of the scrolls and took it to the next stage. Now, I'm not sure where he learned about evolution, but I don't think it's supposed to proceed by such large leaps as the movement from hatred to its opposite, which is love. It didn't matter. He wanted to prove conclusively that Jesus was nothing more than a scarecrow dressed up in stolen garments and stuffed full of other people's notions. He's a composite of a variety of ideas current among Jews of his time. For Wilson, Jesus is a fraud perpetrated by plagiarists. He wrote, and I quote, "I can see from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the role of a Jewish Messiah had been sedulously built up in advance, and that Jesus may well have been assigned and have allowed himself to be assigned to it." End of quote. Why did anyone believe Jesus? Well, Wilson explained for us, because people are just plain stupid. Here's what he wrote. "I can only explain the power of Christianity by the innocent credulity of the human race." At the end of his studies, Wilson comes clean about his ultimate purpose in writing them. He says, "It would seem an immense advantage for civilization that the rise of Christianity should at last be generally understood as simply an episode of human history rather than propagated as a dogma and divine revelation." It never seems to have occurred to Edmund Wilson that the early Christians had noticed all these correspondences that he points out between the life of Jesus and the history of Israel, and that they developed a science around it. They called it biblical typology, and we still use it today. It is, in fact, often introduced as proof positive of Jesus' unique role in human history. He brought to fulfillment all the rituals and laws and prophecies of ancient Israel. Both of Wilson's books were panned by experts, yet they succeeded to a remarkable degree in setting the storyline for the significance of the scrolls. And so they served as models for coverage of any future discovery of documents related to the early history of Christianity. Wilson's book succeeded, in fact, in establishing the outline of the myth of the lost Gospels. They did this even though there were no Gospels to be found among the scrolls at Qumran. You can see the myth applied, for example, in the way the media covered the discovery of an ancient Gnostic library at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. The cache of documents included esoteric Gospels, poems, philosophical dialogues, and such. But it went relatively unnoticed for decades. From 1945 to 1979, no one seemed to care about the Nag Hammadi library. Then in 1979, a scholar from Barnard College published a popular introduction to the texts. Her name was Elaine Pagels, and the book was The Gnostic Gospels. It became a rather sudden bestseller, and she achieved a celebrity to rival that of Edmund Wilson. Not long ago, the New York Times featured her home's decor in the newspaper's style section. So take that, Mr. Wilson. Her book was practically evangelistic in its presentation of Gnosticism. She managed to gloss over its hatred of women, and its dim view of sex, and its loathing of Judaism. She put the focus instead on its radical individualism, and the various ways it was like modern liberalism. She somehow found a kinship between the ancient Gnostics and the modern existentialists, feminists, and environmentalists. Go figure. In the wake of her book, there arose a cottage industry of publications aimed at New Agey neo-Gnostic enthusiasts. Yet, in spite of her Ivy League credentials, Dr. Pagels' book withered under scrutiny by her fellow academics. Bruce Chilton, a scholar of some renown, dismissed the book as a revisionist scenario and an anachronism. The Jesuit Old Testament scholar Paul Mankowski said that Pagels' scholarship is so creative that it should qualify as fiction. He accused her of intentionally falsifying sources, and he called her work an imposture. Yet none of this found its way into the popular press, and Professor Pagels is still quite frequently quoted as the world's foremost expert on Gnosticism. Why? Because she wrote the biggest-selling book on the subject, and because she kept to the grand narrative, the myth of the lost Gospels. In Bruce Chilton's words, Professor Pagels makes the case that, quote, the motivation for the Catholic position was to give the clergy greater power, while the Gnostics nobly pursued their quest of knowledge, end of quote. There go those power-hungry bishops again. The villain in Professor Pagels' book, as you might have guessed, is Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, that nasty defender of the big bad canon and its 4 Gospels. The myth has spun out again and again in more recent years. You probably remember the hype surrounding the discovery of the Gospel of Judas in 2006. Its public debut was in many ways quite unlike that of the scrolls. This time, it was entrepreneurs running the show. This time, there would be no half-century wait for publication. This time, National Geographic would rush to press with 2 books and immediately publish the entire text online in the original language and in English translation. All the news outlets were fixated on this one. But as I said earlier, the Gospel of Judas just kind of withered when exposed to air. The Jesus it presented wasn't compelling. He wasn't even likable. The main thing all this hype accomplished, according to the unbeliever Adam Gopnik, was to remind us, quote, of the literary strength of the canonical Gospels, exactly for their marriage of the celestial and the commonplace. The New Testament scholar N.T. Wright complained that the text of the Gospel of Judas taught us nothing about the real Jesus and nothing about the real Judas. its spectacular rise and immediate disappearance in the 21st century probably traced the arc of its original publication in the 2nd century. A provocative title got everybody's attention, but a lackluster text couldn't hold that attention. Predictably, Elaine Pagels was out in front with the book on the Judas Gospel, co-authored with a younger colleague from Harvard, Karen King. And the mention of that name brings up the next big revelation, promoted as a blockbuster, but ending in embarrassment. In 2012, Professor Karen King made a spectacular announcement at an academic conference in Rome. There she displayed and discussed a tiny fragment of papyrus with just a few words on it. But the few words were shocking. This is the quote. Jesus said to them, "My wife." At that tantalizing point, the text breaks off. I remember at the time expressing my frustration. We're given a Henny Youngman setup line, but we never get the punchline. Predictably, the story was all over the major media. Professor King had carefully orchestrated their reporting, granting limited advance access to the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Smithsonian Magazine, and the Smithsonian Channel, but only if they promised not to run any story before her announcement in Rome. Well, she made her presentation, and the stories were predictably breathless, overpromising the significance of the fragment. This was the big bombshell. Jesus was married! He was not at all the man you think he was. This tiny piece of fabric throws everything into question. But this time the reaction was swift. Immediately, flags were down all over the field, with experts questioning just about every aspect of King's scholarship. Mark Goodacre of Duke pointed out that the fragment, except for the portion about Jesus' heretofore unknown wife, rather suspiciously replicated a Coptic edition of the Gospel of Thomas that was available online. It tracked the online edition so closely, in fact, that it replicated its line endings. And it replicated its typographical errors. And it replicated its grammatical errors. Goodacre said publicly what should have been obvious to a scholar on faculty at Harvard. He wrote, "The Gospel of Jesus' wife was created simply by cutting and pasting text from the Gospel of Thomas, switching a few pronouns, and inserting the key Coptic words meaning Mary and my wife into the patchwork text." Other scholars took Professor King to task for failing to investigate the provenance of the fragment. The earliest known owner, it seems, was a known scam artist. After a couple years of hemming and hawing, even Professor King had to admit that the Gospel of Jesus' wife was most likely a fake. I don't think we've seen the last of this kind of hype. The world is full of archaeologists. The world is full of antiquities dealers. The world is full of con artists, too, who are eager to meet the demand for ancient manuscripts with a dubious supply. The scholar Roger Bagnall recently observed that the study of the Apocrypha is today dominated by ex-Christians and anti-Christians. Why? Because believing Christians just aren't that interested. The question of the significance was settled long ago. Non-Christians also are, in general, uninterested. Really, why should they care about third-rate literary productions in dead languages? That leaves the field to the polemicists. Bagnall said, and I quote, "If you read Elaine Pagels, you'll see the result. The Gnostics are validated as a direction in which Christianity could have gone, and which would have made it warmer and fuzzier, much nicer than this cold orthodoxy stuff." End of quote. But really the Apocrypha, the non-canonicals, the lost Gospels offer us nothing that excels the Gospels we already have and cherish. Nothing that excels them in any way. The theologian Karl Rahner once said that the Church, in deciding the canon, was like a mother at work in her apartment. And down below, in the piazza, there could be 40 children screaming or crying, but she could hear the voice of her own and know it. That's our Mother Church, and that's the voice of the true Gospels. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I ask you to please consider making a donation. We are entirely listener-funded. Just visit us at catholicculture.org and look for the button that says Donate. We're grateful for anything you can give. Your donation counts double if you make it during this Easter season. We've received a matching pledge from a generous donor, and he's willing to match every penny you choose to give up to $60,000. The offer is good until Pentecost Sunday, so please visit us soon, and please give what you can. Remember, we pray for our benefactors every day. I thank you for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.